She had learned to shoot on a rusty single-shot .22 her grandfather kept behind the door of his shed. The stock was chipped and the scope was older than her mother, but it taught her the most important lesson of marksmanship: patience. While other kids her age were chasing fireflies or trading baseball cards, she was learning to read the wind by watching the way the tall grass bent in the field behind his house. She would lie in the dirt for hours, waiting for the perfect moment to squeeze the trigger on a tin can, feeling the recoil bite into her small shoulder. Her grandfather never praised her loudly. He would just nod, spit a stream of tobacco juice into the dust, and say, "You got the stillness in you, girl. You don't fight the rifle. You become part of it." That stillness was what separated her from the pack. In basic training, the drill sergeants noticed it immediately. While other recruits flinched and jerked, she was a statue, and they pushed her toward advanced marksmanship and then toward sniper school. It was a world dominated by men, many of whom looked at the slight woman with the quiet eyes and saw a novelty, a quota to be filled. They didn't see the hours in the dirt. They didn't see the grandfather who taught her that a bullet doesn't care who pulls the trigger, only that the pull is true. She let their smirks slide off her like water. She was there to prove something to herself, not to them. The final test at the sniper school was the one that broke most candidates. It wasn't just about shooting, it was about stalking. They were given a map coordinate, a ghillie suit that smelled of earth and sweat, and 24 hours to move 12 miles through dense forest, evading a dedicated team of instructors acting as hunters. They had to cross open fields, crawl through swamps, and remain completely undetected. One mistake, one snapped twig, one glint of sunlight on a scope, and it was over. She moved like a ghost, a shadow within shadows. She slept in the mud, her body half submerged in frigid water, letting the leeches attach themselves without moving a muscle to brush them off. She was a rock. She was the wind. She was nothing. On the final morning, she arrived at her designated firing point, a small depression behind a fallen log with hours to spare. She settled in, built her natural point of aim, and waited for the target to appear. And the target wasn't a bullseye. It was a small armored personnel carrier over a mile away. The instructors watched through high-powered spotting scopes, impressed and a little unnerved. They hadn't seen her at all. When she finally fired, the shot was perfect, a direct hit on the tiny designated weak point. The round hit the mark with a distant clang that echoed back across the valley. She had not only passed, she had dominated. The graduation ceremony was a quiet affair and held on the same range where the final test took place. There were no families, no bands playing, just the new graduates standing at attention in their fatigues and a handful of senior instructors. The commanding general of the training brigade had flown in to pin the insignia on the new snipers himself. He was a legend, a man from the old school, with a face like carved granite and a chest full of ribbons from conflicts long before she was born. He moved down the line, shaking hands, and exchanging brief words, pinning the small, crossed rifle badges onto their uniforms. When he got to the young woman at the end of the line, his eyes narrowed for a fraction of a second, not in disdain, but in assessment. He had heard the whispers about the quiet female recruit who had ghosted the entire instructor cadre. He stood before her, a full head taller, his presence immense. He looked at the name tape, then down at the newly pinned sniper badge on her chest. He didn't offer his hand immediately. Instead, he turned to the aide standing rigidly behind him. The aide, understanding the unspoken command, stepped forward and carefully placed a long, heavy, foam-padded case on the ground between the general and the soldier. The general bent down, his knees cracking softly in the morning quiet, and unlatched the case. He lifted the lid to reveal a massive Barrett M82.50 caliber sniper rifle, its matte black metal drinking in the morning light. And it was a weapon designed to destroy light-armored vehicles and equipment at incredible distances. It was a cannon, a tool of devastating precision. He picked it up, the muscles in his arms tensing slightly under his dress uniform from the weight, and held it out to her, horizontally across his two palms. An offering, an invitation. Her hands, perfectly steady, reached out and took it. The weight was surprising, a dense, solid chunk of power. The cold metal felt familiar against her skin. She settled it against her shoulder, the stock finding its home in the pocket she had formed from years of shooting. The general watched, his expression unreadable. He then took a step back, his gaze traveling from her face down to her hands on his rifle, and then resting, finally, on the small, newly pinned badge on her chest. The seconds stretched. The other graduates held their breath. The instructors watched, waiting for the verdict. His eyes were fixed on that badge. And it wasn't just a piece of metal. It was a symbol of every mile she had crawled, every hour she had spent frozen in the mud, every doubt she had silenced. It was the culmination of her grandfather's quiet lessons, of her own unyielding will. The general's stare was a test in itself, a final, unofficial examination. He was looking for a crack, a flicker of uncertainty, a reason to doubt the stories he had heard. She met his gaze without flinching. Then her eyes as clear and steady as a pool of deep water. In them, he saw the same stillness her grandfather had seen years ago. He saw the thing that couldn't be taught. He saw the sniper. He saw the badge. And then he saw her. The two were now one and the same. A slow, almost imperceptible change came over his face. The hard lines around his mouth softened, just a little. It wasn't a smile. Not quite. It was something more profound. It was recognition. He gave a single short nod. Not to the badge, not to the rifle, to her. It was a nod between peers, a silent acknowledgement from one warrior to another. He had carried that same rifle into places where the air smelled of cordite and fear. He knew the weight of it, not just in pounds, but in responsibility. He was trusting her with that weight now, and his eyes told her he knew she could bear it. He finally broke the silence, his voice a low rumble that didn't carry to the others. That rifle has been to places you've only read about in after-action reports, he said, his gaze still locked on hers. It's accounted for itself. See that it stays in good hands. He didn't wait for a reply. He simply turned and walked to the next soldier in line, the aide falling into step behind him. She was left holding the Barrett, its immense weight a tangible connection to the legacy she was now a part of. She looked down at its complex mechanism, the thick barrel, the powerful scope. And it was a tool of immense responsibility. One pull of its trigger could change the course of a battle, alter the fate of a family, end a life from over 2 miles away. The gravity of it settled on her shoulders, heavier than the rifle itself. That night, she sat on her bunk in the empty barracks, the Barrett's case locked and secured at the foot of her bed. The other graduates were out celebrating at a bar on post, but she had declined. She needed this quiet, and she pulled out her grandfather's old .22, the one that had started it all, and laid it on the bed next to her. The contrast was stark, the chipped, worn wood of the old rifle against the sleek, tactical polymer and steel of the Barrett. One was the key, the other was the door it had unlocked. She ran a hand over the smooth stock of the old .22, remembering the feel of his rough, calloused hand guiding her elbow, teaching her to breathe. She thought about the general's eyes, and the weight of his unspoken approval. She wasn't just a soldier anymore. She wasn't just a sniper. She was the keeper of a tradition, a link in a chain that stretched back through her grandfather, through the general, through countless others who had possessed the stillness and the nerve to do what needed to be done from a place of hidden silence. Her first deployment came 6 months later. The landscape was nothing like the forests of her training. It was a brutal, mountainous terrain, where the wind howled and the air was thin and sharp. The Barrett was her constant companion now, its weight a familiar burden. The intelligence pointed to a high-value target operating from a compound nestled in a deep valley, over 3,200 meters from the only viable observation post, a jagged, wind-swept peak that offered a sliver of cover. The distance was extreme, at the very edge of the weapon's effective range. The variables were a nightmare. Wind speed, wind direction, temperature, humidity, the rotation of the Earth, the angle of the shot. It was a problem of physics so complex that most would call it impossible. Her spotter, a veteran named Reese who had been initially skeptical of the new girl, ran the calculations on his handheld computer, his brow furrowed. He showed her the numbers, his face pale. The margin for error was measured in inches. A single missed variable would send the round hundreds of feet off course. She didn't say anything. She just looked through the scope, finding the tiny distant structure shimmering in the heat haze. She felt the wind on her cheek, watched the dust devils dance in the valley below, noted the way a distant bird struggled against the current. She closed her eyes for a moment, calling upon the stillness her grandfather had taught her. She became part of the rock she was lying on. She became the wind. She felt the Barrett's heartbeat as an extension of her own. She opened her eyes, adjusted the scope, and made a tiny, almost imperceptible change to her point of aim, overriding Reese's precise calculations with a feeling, a gut instinct born of 1,000 hours in 1,000 different winds. Reese looked at her, about to question the adjustment, to point out the data. But he saw her face, and he stopped. He saw the same look the general had seen. He saw the sniper. "Wind's tricky," he whispered into the radio, his voice calm. "Make your shot." She didn't hear him. She was beyond hearing. She was in the zone, in a place of perfect focus where time itself seemed to slow. Her finger found the trigger, feeling for the slack, the precise millimeter of travel before the sear would release. She exhaled, half a breath, and let the shot surprise her. The Barrett roared, a thunderous crack that echoed off the surrounding peaks, the massive recoil slamming into her shoulder. The ejected casing, hot and bright, spun through the air and landed in the dirt beside her. Through the scope, yet they watched the impossibly long flight of the bullet. It was a tiny speck, almost invisible against the vast canvas of the valley. It took several seconds to cover the distance. Reese held his breath. She did not. She watched. The speck reached the compound. A split second later, the distant sound of the impact, a faint, sharp crack, reached their ears. The target, who had been standing in a doorway, simply crumpled. A perfect hit. Reese stared, his mouth slightly open, and he looked from the compound to the rifle to her. He didn't cheer. He just shook his head slowly, a look of profound respect on his face. "God damn," he whispered, the words carried away by the wind. The impossible shot was real. Back at the forward operating base, the news spread like wildfire. A kill at over 3,200 meters with a single shot. It was the stuff of legend, a record-breaking feat that would be talked about in sniper schools for decades. And soldiers she had never met slapped her on the back. Officers she had only saluted from afar shook her hand. Through it all, she remained quiet, composed. She cleaned the Barrett with meticulous care, her movements as steady as they had been on the mountain. She didn't feel like a hero. She felt like a tool that had been used for its intended purpose. The shot wasn't about her. It was about the mission, the target, the protection of her comrades. She thought about the general, passing her the rifle. He had known. He had seen something in her that even she hadn't fully understood until that moment on the mountain. Reese came to find her that night, holding 2 cups of steaming coffee. He handed one to her and sat down on a crate next to her cot. They drank in silence for a while, the only sounds the distant thump of